James, I'm going to suggest that we make a start. So I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining. We appreciate that we're getting deep into December, and a lot of people are probably not thinking about work as much. So we just wanted to try and squeeze this one in before the end of the year. So what we're going to be talking about today is the contract review workflow and showing you how we can bring some automations, bring a few efficiencies to that process to make the way in which you review your vendor contracts a little bit better. And then we're also going to, time permitting, and James and I are we think we can get through all of this. We want to show you a little bit around contract templates, drafting contracts, the clause bank feature, all within Gatekeeper as well. So what we're going to do now, James is going to show you a workflow in Gatekeeper that is a pretty good workflow, right? And but it doesn't have any automations pre-built. And then what we're going to do is go to like the opposite end of the spectrum, and we're going to show you a completely automated contract workflow. And that has some smaller use cases. It has some very real use cases, especially around NDAs. And what we're trying to do there is just kind of show you the two realities. You can kind of have little automation, you can have a lot, but then what we're going to finish off with is the best practice workflow where we make the best of both, right? Because you'll need some human intervention typically in your contract review process. And we're going to just show you how to harness a lot of those automations. So James, I know we've got a lot to go over, and that's just the workflow piece. That's not the contract side. Should we make a start with that?
Yeah, before we start, can we run we have a poll prepared because what we want to do is get a gauge on the experience of some of the attendees. There it is right there.
Awesome.
Just to
That's Lucy in the background. Thank you, Lucy.
Lucy's working behind the scenes there. So what we want to do is get a gauge on the experience of people attending today. Like, do you have a workflow? How fully configured is it? Just a very simple question, just so we know who we're talking to. And so Daniel, you can pick me up if I'm getting too intense with the functionality we go through, but hopefully we'll cover everything and we'll ramp it up as we go along.
Yeah, so we're going to dive into some of the config, well, quite a lot of config actually, and it may be config that you're not familiar with. So please ask questions throughout. Like, I think that the chat's open, the Q&A is open. Like we've got people in the background that can help answering any questions. We'll answer some questions live where possible, and we will have a little bit of Q&A at the end. And James and I have said this is going to run for an hour. If we need to, we're happy to stay on a bit longer and go through things. So awesome. Yeah. I think the poll's closed. Great. We have some good responses there. Awesome. So James, I think you are good to start showing some of this off, and I'll hand over to you.
Let's get started. So I'll share my screen and just checking, can you see a page with lots of Kanban boards and some purple ones? Right, cool. So I'll jump into that process that you mentioned a second ago there, Daniel, which is a contract, what we call a Gatekeeper e-negotiate workflow, but it's a relatively manual step-by-step process for getting a contract added to Gatekeeper, negotiated and executed. And what we're going to use this workflow to talk about is Gatekeeper actions predominantly, because then, like Daniel said, we're going to move on to how to automate these and make them a bit more sophisticated so they can do more of the work for you whilst you're performing this exact process, getting a contract added. So this workflow, all of these phases basically represent a step in the process for, like I said, getting a new contract requested via an intake form. And I'm not necessarily going to dive into the intake form on this workflow because we've already touched on those in previous sessions, but also we'll look at the best practice workflow for that because it's a bit better. But from what this workflow will do is take contract requests from an intake form through all these step-by-step processes to what you will end up with is the metadata representing the vendor and contract, as well as the actual document, its version history, and hopefully a signed version as well of that document in your Gatekeeper system. So Daniel, if you want to stop me if I'm getting too in the weeds again with this, but basically all of these phases, they're human interaction phases. So like I said, we've called this a manual-ish process because all of these steps in the process would be performed by a human, a user logging into Gatekeeper who's responsible for creating a contract record, creating a draft, negotiating the terms, redlining it, and things like that. But they fall into two different camps on this workflow. So we have some of the simpler ones that many of you, if you have a contract workflow, will have seen already, that are pertaining to the metadata that makes its way into your repository from the intake form. And I've flagged these ones in green just so you can see that they're the simpler ones. And then what we also have are some more advanced ones, and they're to do with Gatekeeper facilitating creating and updating the document versions, and that those ones are flagged in blue. So just to show, and this is going to be one of the only times we actually properly dig in and show a manual version of an action, but just to show what an action looks like for those of you that might not use those on workflows, you might not be a user that's responsible for them. Basically, an action, for the most part, will look like this. It'll be a it'll be a blue button where a user who is responsible for this task here will be able to hit this, and you'll see the action I'm taking now is creating a contract. And what that means is I'm taking something that's on the workflow, so the workflow form data, and I'm affecting something outside of the workflow, i.e. the contract metadata record in the repository. So you can see the way this action works is it's going to take the form data and it's going to give me a chance to check it all over before it goes into the repository, maybe update some values if there are things that are missing or incorrect and so on. And then when I'm happy with that the action's good to go, I can confirm it. I mean, Gatekeeper's warning me that I've missed a few fields, but we're going to try and be quick on this manual
For the
side.
purpose of the demo.
Yeah. And when I hit OK, Gatekeeper will automatically transition the card up to the next phase. And if I open that card up again, we'll see, let me try and move my screen around a little bit. We'll see against this card here, I mean, there's form data and things like that. Against this card here, I've got a vendor record and I now have a contract metadata record. And if I follow this link, in my repository now, I have a record representing that MSA that someone originally requested, and I've turned it into a record. So that was a simple metadata-based action. But now what we come on to are the contract-orientated ones. And these are the ones specifically that you would want in your contracting process anyway, but these are the ones that we will show how to facilitate these in Gatekeeper. And like I said, we're going to be really brief on this workflow, and we're not going to show too many manual actions taking place because we'll see some of them as we get onto the more advanced things later on. But to run you through the story of what's going to happen here, before beginning negotiations, a user is going to generate draft version 1. So using the same blue action button, they're going to choose what's going to be our first contract draft to start with. There's a negotiation loop here where Gatekeeper will send the contract draft to the vendor, and then the vendor can either accept or revise terms and submit new ones, and then it'll come internally for like a review cycle, and the card will keep bouncing back and forth between these phases automatically until someone breaks that loop. And basically once that loop is broken, it'll move through to this final phase. And in Gatekeeper, there's a action we have called publish draft. And actually, I will show this one because it's recently changed on Friday, actually, in our latest product release. So this is a nice chance for me to demo it live. But basically, this one's green, actually. So not all actions are blue, but it's still an action. So what this one will allow users to do is take the Word document that has been negotiated and redlined and reversioned throughout those previous 3 phases and convert it to a PDF, because a PDF is the one that you will want to sign either in DocuSign or Gatekeeper e-sign, but you need to have an action that performs that task. And on the workflow, when you hit publish, there can be 3 available options depending on what you've configured. So the first one is allowing Gatekeeper to create the PDF, because we have a Word doc to PDF conversion tool. So if you tick this top option, as Gatekeeper's confirming here, it's going to convert it for you. And the lower one is if you want to maybe download or if you already have a version of the draft downloaded and you're editing it in Word, you can use Word's own PDF creation tool and upload what you've created there. And there's also a tag option here to say the version you uploaded, it might have been signed as well. So you can use that flag there to say, actually, we can bypass e-sign on this workflow because it's not needed anymore. But when you choose your option here and hit submit, Gatekeeper is going to perform that action for you or upload that draft version for you. And as you can see, this one that I just moved over, if I go to the contract, I'll have to open up the files tab because I don't want to sign this on the workflow, but now we have a PDF version of that contract that I just created. And then
that's cool. We are going to show a little bit of e-sign, right, when we get to the best practice workflow later.
Yeah, because there's 2 elements of config that I want to show on e-sign, not just Gatekeeper side, for the DocuSign as well. Then you have e-sign, which like you just said there, Daniel, that was perfect timing, but we're not going to show it on this workflow, but that's one of the last contracts, like document orientated actions, but it's sort of self-explanatory. It's signing that final document on the workflow. But then the final action that we have on this workflow, a relatively manual one, is updating the metadata. So one thing that some of you eagle-eyed attendees might have noticed back on that create contract phase, the metadata one, the status and approval that I set for the record back at the start of the workflow was pipeline and awaiting approval. And that was very deliberate, right? So it's the case that if, let's say, this contract that's going through the workflow, let's say it took 2 weeks to get to signature, which is a long time, but it's possible. You wouldn't want someone who might have spot that in the repository to see it and think, oh, this is all live, it's approved, it's an active agreement, because it isn't. So you want, if you're creating a contract in a workflow that has a lot of stuff to go, to make sure the statuses reflect that it's not approved. So the thing that we have on this phase here is, now that the contract has been signed, the option to update those 2 key records, so a vendor test, it should say test vendor, but test ven4, and update the contract to reflect that it's going from, as you can see in this case, it's currently pipeline on in both the record and in the form, but I'm going to update it to live and approved, just so that once this whole process is done, Gatekeeper's warning me again that I don't have very good metadata on that contract, so that once this whole process is done and marked as complete, that the record in the repository is now showing it's fully live, it's fully approved, we have the contract that's been signed and gone through negotiation, and they're all the steps that we need to build into this whole end-to-end contract review process. Have I missed anything, Daniel?
No, we're all good. You've covered everything there. I think that's a really good illustration of it's still a good, still a very decent workflow to use. And some people may be using workflows like that. What we're going to go onto now is a workflow that looks ridiculously different, right? Like just even in terms of the just the visual on screen that we're about to see.
Sure.
And fundamentally, every phase has some form of automation. But I won't steal your thunder, and I'll let you talk this one through. But maybe just preface this that a solid use case for this one is a non-disclosure agreement where you're kind of just forcing someone almost to sign the agreement as is. This kind of workflow that we're showing off here becomes a little bit more difficult if we are doing a lot of negotiation or need a lot of review time on the contract. But yeah, James, over to you.
It's interesting that you're saying that this is actually there are practical use cases for this, because if you would have asked me this not even that long ago, I would have said this is just theoretical what we're looking at. This is just to show you what's
depends how hard line you are on.
It depends what your goals are, right? And like if the type of vendors you're dealing with. So what we have on this workflow, and you'll notice that all those phases, well, not all of them, but a lot of those phases we had on the previous workflow are on this one, but I've just slimmed them down so I can show you it in one board without having to scroll around. But basically, these have what we call auto actions. So they still have those actions, the blue buttons or sometimes the green buttons. They still have the tasks taking place, but where possible, Gatekeeper will just do that automatically, hence the name auto action. So how that works is basically the function of an auto action is you don't need a human to perform that conversion of form data to metadata. You can configure an auto action to say, if a card lands on this phase where there's an auto action enabled, Gatekeeper just do it. Like I want the data from this card to just be turned into a record in my repository. And as a result, you can do some of those other things, not just metadata side, but you can do draft generation, you can do draft publishing, the Word to PDF conversion. So what we have here, and I'll kick one off now, we have someone requesting a new vendor called new auto NDA vendor, appropriately named as per your scenario there. And this is assuming this workflow is just to get a simple NDA generated and then sent to them for e-sign. What the user can do, enter those vendor details, like the name, hit submit, and this might load for like a few more seconds than on the previous workflow because it's doing a lot more. But once the user submits that, the card will zoom through these phases, and as we can see, it's now awaiting an external e-signature. So if I open this up and go to the history tab, what we'll see, and this looks a bit much, but don't worry, this is just everything that happened instantly after I clicked submit.
You need the audit trail there, right? So it's good to
see what's happened, to see what's gone on. But basically, it entered a phase where Gatekeeper created a vendor record because we need a vendor record to link to the contract. So it created that vendor called new auto NDA vendor.
Just on that point, with an auto action that's set up to create a vendor record, if there was a pre-existing vendor record, would it just default to finding the existing one?
Yeah, exactly. So you don't have to worry about Gatekeeper creating duplicates. You can't create duplicates with the same name. So Gatekeeper would have found it. It would have, and you get a nice message in this audit trail when that happens. It says vendor already exists, action voided. So it doesn't even try and perform it. It will just skip to the next phase as if it had done the action successfully. It's a good point to raise. So this can work for not necessarily always creating a vendor. You can use it for existing vendors as well. But This one did do it. It created a vendor, then it created a contract record, then it generated a draft document. And I'm aware that we're touching on some actions that we haven't explored fully yet. So I didn't generate a draft on the previous workflow, but that's because we're going to do those on the proper best practice one. And like Daniel said, we're going to jump into actually configuring draft templates as well. So we'll explore this in a bit, but just know that Gatekeeper generated a Word document once the card landed here. Then it converted that Word document to PDF for us. And then as soon as it landed on this phase where it's currently at, it sent it out for e-sign to the vendor. So all of those actions taking place without any sort of human needing to okay them. In that scenario that Daniel mentions, that it's a very low risk but fairly boilerplate type agreement that you just want to give to your vendors to be like, I want your signature on this. There's no element of negotiations here. Just sign off file because we need it for maybe compliance reasons or something like that.
James, just on the use case point, you did mention, I think maybe earlier this week or last week when we were talking about this webinar, that you had a good use case for something like this that I thought would be worthwhile talking about.
Yeah, it's because it cropped up in one of our US-based clients relatively recently. So, and I'd configured it for a client as well. Basically, they had a workflow that looked identical to this. But the scenario there was it wasn't users coming on, choosing the vendor, hitting submit. They were moving to a new region in EU. They were moving some of their service bases and things like that. And they needed like a subset of their vendors to all sign a new DPA or ULEA or something like that. And so rather than go one by one, they actually bulk triggered this workflow for over 100 vendors. And just like we saw there, Gatekeeper pulled the vendors in from the repository because they were vendors they were already dealt with, pulled the vendors in from the repository and automatically started moving them through these phases. And within 30 seconds of that bulk update to the repository, they had 115 signature requests out with their vendors. And from that point, all they needed to do was maybe just check this workflow once a week. And if there were any that hadn't signed it or were dragging their heels, those were the ones that they could reach out to. So there are, you're right. So there are practical applications for this.
Yeah.
It's not I
think there's a lot. No, definitely. I think that like just like if you've got a low risk, high volume contract type that you don't really need to manually review often, because here we're using our own template. That's kind of the generated contract piece. We're using our own terms here. We're comfortable with those. We're not asking for the vendor to negotiate with us. We're just kind of suggesting they sign it. There's a good use case. James, just before we move on to the next workflow, the signature on here is automatically built a signature request, right?
Yep.
Do you want to just quickly go into that?
What, to show the config of it? Because so or are you asking like who it's going to send it to and things like that?
Yeah. Well, kind of all of it, but
I don't want to spoil when we come to the template side, but basically how this auto e-sign works is, and this is generally why again it's more ideal for simpler contract types like NDAs. So I'm just going to open up the config and show that on the actions tab for this phase, we have an auto action enabled, as you can see. And basically, when the card lands here, Gatekeeper is going to initiate e-sign. But because this is a document that might be our terms and there's no negotiation, it's got a pre-existing signature on it. And so as a result, we've already just said send it out to the external party. And let me see if I've had a signature request come through. Oh, I have. I've had loads. All right. So here we go. So this one has gone to Johnny vendor. So this is the email he'd received. And if he clicks through to sign the agreement, this is just standard NDA terms, and this is his vendor name that's been plugged into this contract document. But towards the bottom, it's already put in like our CEO signature because this is our terms and there's no negotiation. So we're happy with these, with this to be pre-signed. So all Johnny would need to do is open this up, sign it, hit I agree, and then back on the workflow. If I reload, you can see it's processing the PDF. That should normally be pretty instantaneous. There we go. Moves it over to the done phase. So awesome. How it will work is Gatekeeper will send the signature to the external contract owner. So you're aware in the metadata of a contract, there can be an internal and external owner. Normally it's to both, but that config that I just showed you meant that we only wanted the external signer on there. We don't want Patrick to have to sign document after document, especially if they're quite boilerplate.
Yeah, absolutely. It's coming back to the point that you can build a really efficient automated process, and this way of doing it has every avenue covered and make sure you're doing things in a very compliant way, a legal way, a pretty cool way. James, let's move on to the best practice workflow. I think that's everything we wanted to show on here.
Yep.
And now we're going to kind of show a hybrid approach to the first two workflows that we've already shown you.
Yeah. So one thing that I just want to call out, like visually on this workflow, it's looks like a hybrid approach as well. So one thing that you'll see on the previous board, all of those auto action phases were minimized, and we've done the same thing here. So basically, one thing to bear in mind is that I can expand these so the board looks the same as it did for that first very manual workflow. But it's the case that with auto actions, because there's never a human that's going to see them or do anything on them, and because cards should never be lingering there, you need to have them on there so you know where they're taking place. But if you can remove the amount of space they take up, it just means that your boards are a bit more readable. So you can see where they land, like where cards are going to visit them. But for this workflow, and I'm sure for people on this call, on this webinar, sorry, that if they have a workflow that's been built relatively recently, or, you know, since this feature was available, the ability to minimize phases, they'll have an approach like this, where lots of the auto action stuff, where users don't need to be aware of them, they're just hidden or like restricted a bit. So that's what we have on this workflow.
Yeah. Well, like to your point, James, that a card should never land in one of these phases, so you don't need to give it any real estate in the Kanban. If it is landing there, it's normally a config error. So
if a card gets
we'll show you how to do this properly though, so to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, no. Cool. So I'll walk through this workflow just to show what's going to happen on it, but then we'll show the automation basically that's taking place. So this one starts the same as the manual one that we saw, and the last one as well, the automated one, where you've got an intake form where users are having to enter the details of the contract they want, such as like what paper do they want to use for this, the vendor's paper or our paper, details about the vendor, details about the contract, and for this workflow as well, because there might be additional metadata that we need to either influence the process later on, like who from our organization needs to approve it and review it, as well as metadata that goes into dictating clause terms and things like that in e-negotiate templates. We've got extra sections here asking for details around the period of the contract, PII, stuff like that.
I think it's probably a good point to call out here that we did an entire dedicated session to sort of intake, request gathering, custom data that's on our knowledge base. So if you haven't seen any of that, definitely go check that out, because we're just kind of making you aware that's kind of how that form's been built, but we can't linger too much on it in this particular one to make sure we get through everything.
Oh yeah, we went into some, like really advanced stuff on that one, so we don't want to get ourselves back into that and take up all the time. Cool. So, and there's an element of this workflow which is one that you're probably going to pick me up on it when we come to talking about e-negotiate templates, Daniel. But this workflow, before any of the auto actions and gatekeeper automation and even just actions are taking place, there's an element of another human having to review this. So there's like 4 eye checks going on here. So after a user is requesting a contract, there's a phase here called initial review, where basically, and this could be configurable to maybe a line manager of the requester, it could be a group like the contracts team or the finance team checking, there's budget for whatever's being requested, or in fact there's scope and there's the desire for the requirement for the service that's being requested here. But before the workflow kicks off and jumps properly into contracting actions, it's the case that there's 2 phases where data has to be entered and reviewed. So this phase here is designed for that, to check the metadata and indeed the contract itself that's about to go into the negotiation process. Because you don't want to, I know the last workflow we talked about being very useful in some scenarios, but you don't want all contracts to just go straight to e-signature because someone's requested them. You want some element of a gatekeeper checking that process, right? Gatekeeper in the real sense of the word.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like you'll typically need someone to review the request as legitimate, genuine in some way, and then like legal contracts can plan the action of, are we going to use our supplier terms, vendor terms, or are we going to push back, use our terms, and just figure all of that out, prioritize the work, assign people to work. So there's a lot to be done in that initial review phase.
Yep. So after those 2 initial checks, the submission from here and the approval from here, what we have is our first auto action. So I'm going to expand this to show you. But so basically, this is that action I actually performed manually with the big blue button to say create contract. But how this one works is, rather than a user doing it, it's Gatekeeper doing it. So how these auto actions work is, we showed this with the e-sign, with the auto e-sign, and we gave a glimpse of it, didn't we? But you will come to this actions phase. So say when cards land here, run this task. But because there are elements of sometimes the form, you might have minimized it to make it a bit simpler for users to fill out. So there are some form fields that won't be there, but there are also some fields that you want Gatekeeper to use the input. There's an option here to say edit the auto action values. And this is the really key config screen for this action. So if I open this up, what you'll see is all of those contract metadata fields that exist in that form that the user fills out. It's not necessarily all of them that they might have been filling out, so they might not have put in things like the status and approval, but all of them are here because it allows you as a workflow config admin to decide how is Gatekeeper going to run this task. And so as we go through, you'll see for the most part, what I have ticked for this action is to say this blue box on the right-hand side, which is take the value from the form. And what that means is of those two previous phases, the request form and that initial review, the data that's been inputted there should be treated as the data we want to go into the repository. So whatever the user puts as the contract name, use that. Whatever they put as the vendor, you don't really have a choice on that. Gatekeeper can't choose the vendor for you. But whatever they put as the currency, the value, the contract type, take that from the form and put it into the metadata record. There are two exceptions to this, but you can hard code values into this however you want. And these are for those fields that I actually mentioned in the first workflow as well, status and approval. So in the exact same vein on that first workflow where I manually set pipeline and awaiting approval, what we can say here is don't look at the value in the form. So I've left this box unchecked. And I've said for any new contract we're creating, it's of course not going to be live and approved because it's just been created on the workflow. So set it to pipeline awaiting approval until the end of the workflow once it's been fully executed and done.
Just on that point, I know when we were talking last, I mentioned like, and for everyone else's benefit, you can do this on with any of these data points, right? And one that I mentioned was entity. Like a lot of organizations maybe only contract with their vendors from a dedicated entity. So really, this part is all about shortcutting the amount of data entry and just making sure that everything is consistent across your entire contract portfolio. So it's a really nice way to build in some super easy, I think, automation, especially when you compare that and contrast it with the intake form and the review data, because you've got some fairly good data that's been reviewed by people that are competent, and then you've got all of this to go alongside it. You can start to trust your data very early on.
Yeah, I mean, and you can see, like you just mentioned, if you've got an intake form with lots of data because you like your processes to be very thorough, as much as you can, if you can minimize that intake form. So status and approval, I will have hidden those from my intake form because I'm going to hard code them anyway. I don't care if someone needs to see them or wants to try and put a contract in as live and approved, which they shouldn't. But yeah, if you can set backup values for some of these, then you'll make your process for your end users that much simpler. And just as one thing I want to talk about, well, two more things I want to talk about on this screen really quick, Daniel. So
no, all good.
What you might notice is there's some of these where I've just said take the value from the form because we can't decide the category. Maybe like in that scenario you just mentioned, Daniel, you could hard code the entity to say it should always be Demo Co UK or something like that. But there are some where we have a combination of both. So you can see as start date as an example, I've said take the value from the form because the user might say, well, I want this service to start on the 1st of Jan or something like that. But if they haven't, it might still be a nice backup to say, well, if they haven't put one in, maybe because they haven't been very thorough. This isn't maybe a great example, but this is just to show that you can have backups basically to say Gatekeeper will try and take what's been put in by users previously. But if they haven't put one in, assume that it's today's date plus a week, just so that we have something roughly to work on based on our SLAs for getting contracts set up and executed, things like that. And that carries on through quite a few of these. So like RAG status, take whatever the user puts in, if it's a risky relationship or if it's a high risk contract. But if they haven't put anything in, just assume it's green as like a backup because we assume all of our relationships are green when they're at the outset. And that can be downgraded if risks start arising or poor performance starts occurring, things like that.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah,
just to re-emphasize the point that this is core data that is in the repository, but also custom data. So you can do this with all the custom data in the form as well, and just have that all preset. So I think you've got a lot of options here, just to make this is just a very simple thing you can do that makes everyone's life a little bit easier. Just reduces the amount of manual input of data and keeps data consistent, clean, and you can trust it. So yeah, that's great. Awesome, James. Appreciate that. James, just quickly, whilst we're just on that, can we just go back to that? Because
Yep.
the two check boxes to the left of edit auto action values, just to the left there, update form on, yeah, no worries. The update form on action, submit card on action. Can you just explain those two? Because they're both ticked for this to work.
So for most of your auto actions, you'll probably have this one ticked, submit card on action. So for instance, what this means is as soon as a card lands here, Gatekeeper's going to run that task to perform the metadata record creation, but you don't want the card to sit here. You want the completion of that task to move it on to the next part of the workflow. So if you tick this, basically that's exactly what's going to happen. When Gatekeeper runs a task, it's going to say, I'm done, push the card onwards to the next review or the next approval or the next auto action sometimes if you have a few in sequence. And the top one is basically it is what it says. So one thing that, for instance, what it'll do is if the users hadn't put status and approval in the form, because they have now been set to pipeline and awaiting approval, you might want people seeing the card later in the workflow to be like reassured, like this hasn't been neglected, it's been filled in. So this will basically say, of the auto action values that have been pushed to the metadata record in the repository, make sure that the form matches that so that both sets of metadata are aligned, basically. So both of these have been ticked, but this one is the lower one is the obvious one to make sure the cards keep moving through the workflow.
Yeah. So if you were to do this yourself and you find that one of your cards lingers in one of these phases, it's typically because that hasn't been ticked. Yeah, it's just a really easy fix there. And I'm talking from experience there. So that's why I called out that one. Awesome, James. What were you looking at next here? Which phase did you want to go to?
Well, the next phase is an auto action phase as well. But there's less config to discuss here, so I'll quickly bring it up before we go on.
I think it's worthwhile because it does, from memory, look a little bit different as well to what we just showed. So it's definitely worthwhile showing this.
Yeah. So this one was in the previous workflow, that fully automated one. But basically what this is doing is it's not creating a metadata record, it's creating a document, like a physical Word document. And so this workflow will only conditionally send cards to this phase, and it's by that intake form. You'll remember the very first question is, will the vendor want to use their paper or are they content using ours? And if it's the case the user says they're fine using ours, just generate whatever we've got in the system, Gatekeeper will try and send cards here. And as you can see, it's not going to run an auto action to do anything with metadata. It's going to run this one to say generate a draft for the contract record. And in the edit auto action values here, you'll see these are all the contract types we have that Gatekeeper could be generating drafts for. And what you can configure here is to say, which template do I want it to use? So for instance, I have a few different NDA templates. So I'm going to say, like, if someone does request an NDA on this workflow, make sure I use the NDA latest version, because, you know, in this case, I've called it NDA latest version. You might have a few different types. You might have a UNDA.
I've seen worse version names than that in my time.
NDA
so
version,
I feel like this is completely legitimate to use one. There. But James, can we just quickly? I think we need to call out that we've not shown you yet how to upload templates into Gatekeeper. We're going to come on to that towards the end. But this is a really cool way just to shortcut, just sending out a template on your paper.
In fact, I'll configure this to say NDA latest version now, but later on, I think we'll show how to create a new NDA one, and I'll come and just to go full circle, I'll come back here and show how to set this in your auto action.
Just a quick time check for you. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I just wanted to make you aware, just so we definitely squeeze all this. No worries.
Okay, so we're off auto actions now, like for the time being. But one thing you'll notice is this auto create draft phase is immediately followed by like an initial draft review. So before that negotiation loop that we saw previously, there is still a phase where drafts can be checked over before they go out to the vendor or they go for internal negotiation. And we'll look at, why don't we look at this one that you added on here? And this is an action phase. And the reason cards might land here without Gatekeeper having generated that template draft might be in this scenario. So this was a card that you put on here, Daniel, and you said the vendor doesn't want to use our paper. So you attached an NDA document that maybe the vendor had given you. And this might be a common scenario, right, for quite a few people on this call, where either they don't have a template for a particular contract type, or sometimes the vendors that they're dealing with are like, here's our terms, we want to use
They're very adamant, right? The vendors normally, they want to use their terms.
It's a power struggle. Yeah, you might
always
have that.
This is my life.
And so what you have as an option here, when you as maybe a member of the contract management team perform your action, you have the choice. So you can see Gatekeeper is giving you the option to say, for this NDA that I'm starting with the software partner, I can either use a template that I've uploaded to Gatekeeper. So these are some of the ones, including that NDA latest version, or because I saw that Daniel said they want to use their paper, I can choose that file that he linked to the card to serve as draft version 1. So you have the option here to ignore Daniel's suggestion, or you can just take the file that he's put there and just hit create, and that'll start the negotiation process. So just that's one of those things to be aware of at this phase. You have both of those options. I'm going to use a template though, because using the I don't know what the file you uploaded was. It might be empty or something like
No
that.
idea. I wouldn't trust anything I put in on this workflow this week. Yeah.
That's fine. So I've created my draft version 1 now, and I know that like you just said a second ago, Daniel, we haven't shown how to configure renegotiate templates yet. But one thing that I just want to call out is how they work. When Gatekeeper generates a document, so we've got our first version here, we're on version 1, and Gatekeeper generates a Word document for you from a template. One that you'll get is a nice, this I really like this view merged fields option. So basically what this is telling you, in that template that I just generated for you, I spotted something that we call handlebars, and I'm planting these seeds now so that when we're configuring our template later, we can call back to what a handlebar is. But I spotted these references to certain metadata fields, and because of the values that were inputted in the form, I've merged this data into the document. So I spotted this handlebar to say, put the supplier name in. Oh, and it was with Atlassian. And so in this document, I put Atlassian Pty Limited. And I spotted that there was a clause referenced. So I've put this contract shall remain in place for 5 years or 2 years with an extension of 5 years after termination or something like that. So this is a nice screen. If you are using contract templates and you're generating like this, what you might want to do is come here and check what handlebars the Gatekeeper spot and what did it merge in data. And I should have actually intentionally removed some of the data that you put into this form, because what this will also do, if Gatekeeper spots a handlebar, but there wasn't maybe you hadn't put a vendor legal name, maybe you just put the regular name of the vendor, Gatekeeper will tell you that here as well. It'll highlight it in big red text and it'll say, I couldn't find a value for this, just to let you know when you're going to start revising the draft or negotiating it, there's going to be a big blank gap where it would have tried to put Atlassian Pty Limited, but whoever filled out the form wasn't thorough enough for this template. So this is a nice screen to check what's happened and what do I need to be aware of.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I'll kick that over to the vendor user now. Let me just really quickly check the contract that we put in to make sure they've got someone, Victor vendor, to show the first step of e-negotiate. So now that I've created my draft and I could check it over, but all the values merged in fine, I'm going to submit that over to Vincent vendor. And how vendor renegotiate works in Gatekeeper once it's been configured is, if I go back to my emails here and refresh, got a lot come through from the system. This will be the email that goes to Vincent. It will say that James Ince has created a draft for him. And basically that draft version I just generated with Atlassian Pty Limited and that effective clause of 2 years plus 5 plus, oh, I misspelled that, 2 years plus 5 years is in here. Vincent can download that, edit it however he wants, and then make his decision on what he wants to do. This email gives him some dedicated links to either submit a new draft if he has red lines to provide, or accept it. And basically how you configure that is fairly simple. On the form access side, you select vendor e-negotiate for this phase. Worth noting, you don't need vendor portal for this because it's just a dedicated workflow feature. So all of you that are watching, if you don't have vendor portal, you don't need to worry about that. It's just an in-workflow feature. Select vendor renegotiate. Select who from the vendor should be responsible for receiving that draft. So Vincent was the owner of this contract, so that's why that email went to him. And over on the action side, what we've enabled for him is the ability to submit a contract draft. And what you'll see is that we've also ticked this option to say only allow him to submit and approve. So sometimes when you configure this, your vendors will also, in that email I just showed you, have a big red button that says reject draft alongside these. But I've removed that by default from this workflow because, yeah, it's not very productive to give them a button sometimes to just say no. You want them to actually make changes or hopefully accept. So you're just limiting the options that they have available from this email. Is there anything else we need? Do we need to run a poll right back now, Daniel, or are we hustling through to get to draft templates?
James, I may have missed it because I was just doing some Q&A and in the chat there. But
Sure.
where we going to show Office for the web briefly?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, we can do that.
I think
So
that's pretty well. Just whilst we're like lingering there,
yeah.
it could
So
be
let
just
me.
called.
I'm just going to submit the same draft that I just provided to Vincent just for speed. So I'm going to assume that Vincent is submitting this. I'm actually just going to put no changes.
Don't
I'm
worry
going to
about the
spell that. I'm
typos.
going to
It's
spell
fine.
that wrong for speed as well.
That's all good.
So when Vincent submits this, you see the card automatically moves through and it goes to internally negotiate. If you want to, you can download the file in the exact same way Vincent might have done. You can, and then you can come back here and you can upload a new version to the card, or if you're happy with his changes or you want to send it back or reject it or so on, you can do that. What we also have though, which improves the negotiation process a lot if you use Microsoft Office and you have a business license, is the ability to not necessarily have to take things out and then bring them back to manage the version history. So what we have is an Office with a web plugin. So you'll see because Vincent uploaded a new version here, we've started incrementing the version history. So Gatekeeper is managing those. And it's still very useful if you want to keep downloading and uploading new versions, you're keeping track of them. But what this allows you to do when you hit edit Office of the web, is just edit that version in browser and start making changes directly here. So I can come here and I don't know, maybe I want to correct that typo that I know that I noticed in the clause where that says 2 instead of 5. So I want to come and make edits to it could be like severe edits and comments and things like that, or it could just be correcting typos because I make a lot of those. And basically what's going to happen is every time I come and make a change here, Gatekeeper automatically saves it. However, it won't increment the version until I use this Gatekeeper plugin that's automatically loaded and say, I'm done with all my changes now. I want to go back to the workflow with this version that I've been editing in Office for the web. And so when I hit save here, it's just going to take a second to load. It's going to close that tab and take me back to the workflow. And we'll see we're now on version number 3. So I've incremented the version number because I had to change a typo, like an inaccuracy in the term of the contract. And that one's really simple to enable, to be fair. That one's even simpler than configuring a vendor renegotiate phase. All you need to do on the actions tab for that is alongside the submit contract draft, the ability to revise the draft version, just enable the Office of the Web plugin here. And that will give users who are on this phase the ability to hit edit in Office of the Web.
Yeah, that's great, James. Just to call out, you need to have an active Microsoft subscription to enable that. We can't do that through Gatekeeper, and it's just very important that if you do want to use that, you like you said, James, you commit the change using the plugin, hitting the save button. If you forget to do that, it won't commit the change to Gatekeeper to alter the version history, so it won't add another number like you just showed, and won't add to the version history log. So yeah, super useful. James, is there anything that we haven't shown that we absolutely? Oh wait, we need to show e-sign first.
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
I want to show DocuSign and e-sign. So right, so
let's do that, and then we'll move on. And then we'll move on to the contract templates element.
So I'm not going to show publish because we showed that already. But basically, this workflow has a publish. We've called it draft finalizations phase here. Because you might have a contract that maybe went through a lot of revisions and redlining and commenting, and you might not necessarily want Gatekeeper to automatically perform the action without, again, someone having reviewed it, because you're about to send this out for final approval and e-sign. You don't want it to be full of red lines that you forgot to remove. So there is a manual phase to finalize the draft before either you publish it here or you give it to Gatekeeper to publish. But yeah, then there's a pre-approvals phase, but then there's e-sign. And this e-sign phase, if I take you under the hood to show you what's configured here, this one's fully manual because for the most part, you can't just fire off e-signatures willy-nilly. You want a bit of control over where they're going, especially if you have lots of different signing rules and approval and matrices and stuff like that. But on this one, we have 2 e-sign actions enabled, and you can enable them alongside each other. Basically, one allowing our use of a DocuSign integration, and one allowing, this is just called e-sign, but it's Gatekeeper's native e-sign solution. And there's one feature that I've enabled here, really new, I think only 2 months old, called the e-sign approval history. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But when a user opens up a card on one of these phases, what they'll see is the ability to hit start. And because I've enabled both of those actions, they'll be able to choose which one do I want to use. And if they're using DocuSign, I'll hit Save and Next just to take you into the screen. Just like Office for the web, Gatekeeper just gives you the document ready to sign in browser, like over the top of the workflow. And I can add my recipients, like I'll add myself just for speed.
So we're using the DocuSign look and feel here. We just put it into a modal, put it into Gatekeeper,
exactly.
right?
And this might be one of those scenarios that, like, if your vendor that you're dealing with is only comfortable using DocuSign, then this is great. Because if I hit send now, and I'll be sending this to myself. Let me go back to my emails. If I hit send now, I should see is the email itself comes from DocuSign. So it's not like it's coming from Gatekeeper via DocuSign. It's just James Ince, whoever the user was, via DocuSign. So you understand. So it's one of those trusted things. Like if it's a vendor that you're dealing with who only trusts that single e-signature solution, then it all looks fine and it works exactly how DocuSign does.
Just to add, you need to have a separate DocuSign subscription
just like
for that.
That
does come. Whereas the native Gatekeeper e-sign is included in your current package anyway. Just to add that.
And DocuSign charges via like envelope quotas and things like that, doesn't it? Whereas Gatekeeper's just you can sign as many documents as you want. So it is probably quite handy if you have a DocuSign subscription, keep both of them enabled on this phase, because there might be some contracts where you need to use DocuSign, but for the ones where maybe Gatekeeper e-sign is fine, then you're saving on those envelopes that you might be using up.
James, Alan has asked, how do we enable DocuSign? And I believe I have not done too much, but it's in settings, and then we have it there in config.
Yeah. It might be the case that in the background, you need your CSM to switch it on for your whole tenant. But once it's enabled in settings.
So they see it here, right? That's what you mean by that.
To enable this menu option. But once you have that, you can just come here and mine's already connected, but you just hit connect and then it will log you into DocuSign and just say Gatekeeper wants to like connect the systems. And you just hit approve and it's instantly ready to go. And you can see it also copies who's authorized to send Gatekeeper e-sign documents as who's authorized to send DocuSign documents as well. So really quick to do. You can do it in like 3 or 4 clicks, but you need to maybe, if you can't see this option, DocuSign in your settings configuration screen, you might need to contact your CSM and be like, can you switch that on for me so I can start using it? And then if you want to embed it in workflows, it was that thing I just showed on an e-sign phase like this. On the Actions tab, tick Enable DocuSign, and it's ready to go.
Yeah, awesome. Excellent, James. No, I appreciate that. We are going to move on. Lucy, we do have a... Oh, go.
One thing I want to show the Gatekeeper e-sign feature because I think it's really cool.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I forgot we had to show that. Go, James.
So this was a contract I sent for myself. I sent to myself to sign. So James Ince sent it to James Ince to sign. First, I mean, it's got the contract AI summary. We've already talked about that, I believe. So like if you have OpenAI enabled for your tenant, Gatekeeper will send to your signatories internal signatories an AI generated summary of what's in the document, just so they get their memory refreshed. But also when those users go to sign, if you've got that setting enabled, I just showed you in the workflows page, they will see below where they have to provide their signature details. There's a tab here called approval history, and this will show them what went on during the contract workflow. So I can see here on that final approvals phase, the phase that was right before my e-signatures, that Mel and Laura each like checked over the contract. They confirmed all the services were in scope and the budget was approved. So I can be rest assured, like if I'm like a CEO, I don't have time to go through the workflow and see like what did this card do and dig into the audit trails. And I also don't want to have to ping someone each time to be like, what's this? Have you looked at it? I can see that approval history summarized below and I can sign it quite happily knowing that the right people have seen it before me. So that's a pretty cool feature with the Gatekeeper e-sign.
And it's also highlights that as a feature that I really like, that when you approve something, just write a little one-liner about why you've approved it, or send a little positive message about it, because it kind of gives that clarity. Like my CFO, COO used to always want to see, like, have you actually reviewed that? Because if you just hit accept without putting something, I'm not quite sure. So this is great. And I would just encourage people to think about it like that. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
James, I do want to move on.
Sorry. Yeah. No, that was the last thing. Okay.
No, that's fine. We are just going to run a little poll in the background. We're just going to keep talking. And really the poll is all about, if you want some help setting up these auto actions and things like that, we can definitely get your CSM to reach out to you and start helping you with that. But James, whilst that poll's live,
Mhm.
we're done with workflows. We're going to go and show off and show how to do some of the contract draft creation and templates, right?
Yes, we are. So let me get up a document that I will be editing.
Awesome. And just whilst you're doing that, we had a question from Brenda about, do we see Adobe Sign as an option in the near future? I'm not sure, Brenda. We will find out for you. We'll let you know. And we're just asking our product team now if it's on our roadmap or if they're looking at it. But we can let you know with the comms that go out as part of this.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Okay. Have you lost your tenant, James?
No. I'll share it. I'll just wait for the poll to close and then
No, sorry. Just carry on. We're good. We'll
All
just
right,
leave
okay.
that up for another
I'll
30
I'll
seconds or
get it on
so.
my screen then.
And yeah, we can start going through that.
Actually, I'll show where to go first before I jump into the document.
Yes. Awesome. Cool. So James, what are we looking at now?
So what we're going to build now is that template I selected earlier that was called NDA latest version that was named
Sure.
atrociously. How to actually get those into the system so that on workflows when your users want to be able to select them or you want your auto actions to run them and generate documents for you, where you configure those in the background so that they're ready to go. And so the way that you do this is you will go to settings, configuration, you negotiate contract templates, and you'll see these are those versions that I showed earlier. So there's a lot of NDAs and there's that NDA latest version. What you'll do is you'll go add MS Word template, and there's just a few things that you need to enter, but the main bit is the actual template document itself. And so let me just deck 13th, because I did promise that we would show configuring one in a workflow. Deck 13 version, you choose the contract type for which this document will be able to be selected or will automatically generate when people are requesting NDAs. This one can automatically generate. And then you say if you want this template to be ready to go straight away, you set that to live. The important bit is the document itself. So how you go about configuring that is, I mean, one thing that you mentioned to me, Daniel, and I disagreed at first, but there's a point here is that
I don't know where you're going here.
well, like a lot of our clients, when they come to Gatekeeper, might have like a SharePoint folder that's got like just examples of previous contracts. And
Sure.
you made a
Yes.
point that you could just straight up upload those here because at the very least, it will save users when they're going through a workflow. It will save them having to leave the workflow, find that SharePoint folder, make a duplicate, then bring it back to Gatekeeper. You could just upload one of those templates straight here and it will generate, and then you can make the changes in Gatekeeper using Office for the web and stuff. However, I would never recommend a client do that, but you can if you just want to get started. But what we have here is this option to pop out some handlebar instructions. And I made reference to handlebars earlier. And just to summarize them, handlebars are just references to fields in the Gatekeeper data model that when you put them in your document, when Gatekeeper spots them, it will replace them with the actual value of the metadata. So one thing I had in the template that I generated earlier was the supplier legal name. And what that took and put in was Atlassian Pty Limited, because it was a contract between Synergy Technology and Atlassian Pty Limited. So what I can do is, on the tab, I've got a template document. I can take this handlebar over to that document and I can paste it in where I'd want Gatekeeper to put Atlassian Pty Limited or Acme Demo Co. Inc. and so on. And so this file here might look quite familiar to some of you because a lot of Gatekeeper clients come to us with documents just like this one with basically like tabs or highlighted text to say, enter the supplier name here. And this is like a job that the contract requesters have to do, right? They'll have to go through and replace all the values that they know or the terms that they want to put in. So what you would do instead is you will paste in that handlebar. That doesn't look very good. I'll worry about formatting later, but you'll paste in that handlebar. And so when the template is generated on a workflow in real life scenario, Gatekeeper will spot that and it will replace it for the user because they should have filled everything in the intake form, right? And there are a few different types. So if I go back to this handlebar instruction screen, there's data. So contract data, and you can see we've got some core fields like annual value, description, dates, and so on, as well as custom fields. So any custom field you add to your data model, Gatekeeper will generate automatically a handlebar for that, but it'll just give it an ID basically. So stuff to do with GDPR over here. I can plug into my documents, just plugging in these custom fields. Got supplier and entity data as well. But there are other types of handlebars to do with e-signatures. So what these can be done, and I'll put one of these in my document as well. If you have a template document where there are certain dotted lines where signatures are always going to go, if you've used Gatekeeper eSign or even just that DocuSign demo, then what you'll have noticed is adding signature objects to a document is a lot of clicking around. Like you're choosing the signatories, you're choosing which object, you're plonking it on the actual document. And if you're doing that for signature, name, title, company, date, for like maybe 4 or 5 signatories or just many documents per day, it's very cumbersome. So what you can do is where those dotted lines are going to go, you can paste that handlebar, and Gatekeeper will spot this. And just like with the metadata, when it goes out for signature using Gatekeeper eSign, place the signature object there. And I'm not going to do all of this for all 8 because that's going to be very boring to watch, but you can do
Yeah.
it works with
Don't do
Gatekeeper
that.
eSign.
I was just going to say, James, like this is one thing I did with the one NDA, which is by TLB, which is like that standardized NDA. We just put handlebars into it. It was already a non-negotiable non-disclosure agreement, and someone has a request, you just send that out, and it's pretty much done. And
so
all you need to do
all
is
the values of who you're dealing with, and it's just ready to go, ready to sign.
Yeah. So easy to do, and obviously it's got use cases outside of non-disclosure agreements as well, for sure.
And one thing I've configured here, I'm not going to linger too long on it because it's relatively advanced, but there are not just data handlebars and signature handlebars, there are clause handlebars. So one thing that you'll spot is, again, if those eagle-eyed attendees will have spotted, I had in my form and in my contract data a period that was called custom period brackets years. And that field had responses. Let me see if I can edit in a different tab real quick just to show you the field.
James, just a quick time check. We've got about 40 seconds, I think, to the end of the webinar. So it would be, if you can show this super fast, because I imagine some people might drop off. We'll just stay on a little bit longer anyway.
Basically, this field has a few drop-down options: 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, indefinite. And so rather than users selecting huge swathes of text in the custom fields, what you can configure is a clause. Let me just drop out of this screen real quick to say, for that field, custom period, if the user selects 1 year, put all of this into the contract. Or if they select 5 years, put all of this into the contract. And so rather than, again, pasting huge swathes of metadata, when you're configuring a template like we're doing now, under this contract clauses area, you can get the same thing, a handlebar, and go back to your file. And for all of this clause 4 here, I'm just going to remove it and put this in. And Gatekeeper will do the same thing that we saw with Atlassian PTY Limited. It'll just find the clause, and based on the metadata value that the user selected in the form, we'll paste in the entire appropriate clause that it said like 5 years. I mean, mine was incorrect because it said 2 years brackets 5. But that's how that works as well. So it doesn't just work for individual fields. It works for entire clause sections. So you can, if some of the clauses in your templates are fairly variable, depending on elements of the contract or the vendor relationship, you can replace them with handlebars like this. So when Gatekeeper generates your templates, they are appropriate to the requests for which they've been generated.
Yeah, this is a really good way to minimize the amount of like templates you have, right? You effectively have one template and then variable clauses for each of those clauses that need those variations. It means you don't need to have like an NDA template for 1 year, 2 year, because all of that becomes such a headache. And also like just things like jurisdiction, choice of law, like depending on where you're contracting, where the vendor is, where your legal entity is. There's so much you can do with this. It is dependent on you having some form of clause bank, right? And I pretty much every legal team I've worked within or had the pleasure of working with, most of them have some form of clause bank. If you can get it into Gatekeeper and start thinking about it like this, it kind of takes you up a level in terms of automating contracts with trusted language that you use within your business.
Yeah. So I just did that whilst you were talking, but basically I saved that version with all those handlebars in it, and I did it in Office of the Web. But again, if people are doing this in Word on their desktops or wherever, that's fine. And you take that version and upload it here. And so when I hit save now, I'll remember that's called the Deck 13 version. If I go back to my workflow real quick and open up that auto action phase, actions, I can edit this instantly. This one's already available for me to select. So any new NDAs that come through where there's auto action runs, it's going to use that new version I've just uploaded with all the relevant handlebars and clauses. So that's how simple it is basically to upload those e-negotiate templates from a pre-existing document, having just replaced some of the variable fields and clauses in there.
Awesome. Cool. James, was there
Cool.
anything else you wanted to cover? I appreciate like
Yeah,
I've kind of
one
pushed
one
you there.
one thing real quick, and I'm really sorry because it's so minor. But before
No,
we finished the workflow, there was a final auto action that I'd enabled here. So you'll remember on the very first manual
I know
workflow,
which one.
I remember I updated the contract to say now that it's been signed, it's live and approved. You can have the workflow do that. So on this done phase, you'll see auto action update contract. This isn't really there's only two hard coded values. Everything else is basically just taking what's in the form, but it's saying the status is live and the approval is approved because it's landed on contract executed done. It is those things. So yeah, that's the final automation I wanted to talk about on this contracting workflow.
Yeah, it's a really important one because like the way I was looking at this when I was implementing Gatekeeper is that I don't want to have to press any buttons like that. Like
No.
I have no, that's kind of what you're doing in Excel, like dragging down on a drop down and things like that. This method just completely replaces that. So really big on that. Cool. James,
Mm.
was there anything else? I'm just having a look here for our notes. I think we did everything. We showed the e-sign just now on the handlebar, a bit of clauses. I think clauses we could probably get into another time in a bit more detail if people are interested in that. But I think if people are really interested in finding out a bit more about that, we can get your customer success manager involved and get them to come and help you. I will just say, like, I appreciate we've gone super fast. If there are any questions, drop them. Drop them. We've kind of been answering some as we have been going along. I appreciate that we are over time. So if you do want to ask a question, do so now. James, I'm just having a look here to see if there are any questions. We've covered DocuSign. You need a DocuSign account, but as long as you have a DocuSign account, your CSM just needs to turn it on. Super easy to set up.
Same with Office for the
Multiple.
Web. That if you
Same
have
for
that
Office for the Web.
account, the integration is free, but you might need your CSM to switch it on for your tenant just so you can get using it.
Yeah, just one point that we kind of covered on Office for the Web, which was, does it automatically save new versions? So within Office for the Web, when you're making the changes, it is saving in Office for the Web as you do it. It's just that when you press that save button, it commits it back to Gatekeeper, right? That there's just a slight distinction there I wanted to make. So every change that you make whilst you're in Office for the Web is being saved, and that's all on Microsoft's platform. But to commit it to Gatekeeper, you do just need to hit save.
Yeah, which is very intentional, right? Because if you have lots of people making edits, you don't want this to turn from version 7 to version 50 because you typed a sentence, saved it, typed a sentence, saved it. So it's very deliberate when you choose to make sure this goes from 7 to 8, for instance.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that Gatekeeper extension allows you to do that.
Awesome. Yeah. Jones just asked, do you only have DocuSign or can you use other like OneSpan? At the moment, like the only other we only have DocuSign as an external digital signature tool, it's a piece of software that we integrate with Gatekeeper. Otherwise, we have the Gatekeeper e-sign at the moment. We did have a question earlier on about the Adobe signature one as well. We'll talk to our product team, and if we have like any plans for anything else, we're trying, if we're allowed to, let you know next week in the email. Just a slight caveat there. If things are really early days, we'll probably just say no to start with. James, Jessica has asked a question. Can you tell us about the transitions feature in the workflow settings? The beta feature, does that just help us to see where we've messed up the transition config? So Jessica has said there's a cog in the workflow, and Andrew, who is on the call in the background, has also wrote workflow diagrams beta feature.
Oh, right.
So
okay. The transition.
So maybe
feature.
Right. Let's show that. Sorry, that's just us being completely blind there as well. So I appreciate that.
So
cheers, Andrew.
There's actually two. If you're a workflow admin, you can follow this cog, and there's two cool features here. One is the global form edit view. So what you might have noticed is if you built workflows historically, if you want to edit forms field settings on a particular phase, you've got to go to that phase, go to the form tab. And if you have a lot of phases and you need to do things en masse, it's very cumbersome. So what you can actually do from here is in one screen, start making edits to like loads of different fields at once, like without having to click around loads. But this is what Jessica was referring to, the transitions graph view. So basically this workflow is a behemoth. It has a lot of conditional transitions and forwards and backwards. So this one is never have gonna been perfect, because as you can see, it's not even just got approvals, rejections, submissions. It's got timers that move cards as well. But what this will do is, in some cases, give you a diagram just illustrating where cards go so that you don't have to dig into the config and open the transitions tab. You can look at this view and be like, okay, when a draft is submitted from here, it's either going to go through to this final approvals phase, or it's going to go through to this publish phase, things like that. So the goal of this, and there's going to be other iterations of it coming in time because we're going to build in things like conditions. The goal is to not have to dig around all of the config. You can just come here and see where should cards be going based on the actions that are being performed or the approvals that are being given at various phases. But yeah, it's still in beta because, as you can see, for big workflows like this one,
it's super hard to do.
It's really hard.
For one, just to code this kind of stuff.
Exactly, because like this is like live. I could go and edit this phase, like changing the actions and transitions at fire, and then come back here, and this diagram will have instantly updated. But yeah, like you just said, it's hard to get a diagram generator that can handle this level of complexity very well. So it's still in beta at the moment.
Yeah, and like to your point, like when you do the conditional transitions, and you'll know from like customers you've worked with, James, and I know from personal experience of using Gatekeeper, you can do quite a lot, right? And sometimes when you're going between two phases to figure out like, if I do this, where's this going? Like it can just become so impairing to do it in the phase view. So this is great to be able to like, just check in and see what it is here.
Yeah. And for simpler workflows, it could even be a tool like, I think there's an export button somewhere. There we go. For simpler workflows, if this diagram does get to a point where it looks clear, you can export this to a PNG, like an image file, and you could just give it to your end users to be like, I'm about to train you on this process. Here's the big picture, so you know where like you fit in, or you know what is going to.
Or your auditors.
Or your auditors, yeah.
My immediate thoughts were policy documents and auditors. Like auditors always ask, "What's your policy? What's your processes?" And you normally have somebody who's sort of process map. But then, like, does it actually work how you're saying in your software? Like that's the question. And then you have to take them through the workflow. This is a really good way to just be like, "Well, this is actually how it works in Gatekeeper." You can see that. Addison's asked, when does this move from beta? I don't personally know. And I'm looking at your face, James, that you don't know.
No, I don't.
We will try and come back to you on that afterwards. We're not too sure. How long has that been out? Not long, right? Was it last month? I kind of lost track.
Last month, I think.
As beta, out in beta form, though, right?
Yeah. And it's being worked on because I mean they were testing it using the best practice workflows, and this is indeed best practice contract request workflow. So they are using it on complex processes like this. But yeah, it takes work to decide how to fit everything on the page and still make it clear and concise.
Awesome.
Yeah, we
cool.
can chase that up.
Okay, I'm just gonna do a last call for questions. Did we do the final poll? I can't recall if we did the final poll.
Yeah, Lucy.
We did. Awesome. Yeah, I kind of lost track there. Just going through this. Appreciate it. So next steps for us, James, we'll get this webinar recorded and put together. We'll send you out an email. And yeah, I appreciate for everyone that came along and everyone that stayed a little bit longer to make sure that we got through everything and whoever asked questions. So really appreciate that. Hope everyone has a wonderful Christmas break. And we should be back. We'll be back in the new year with more webinars. We are getting towards the end of the Success Hour sort of series. This might be the last one we do on the control series before we go into the safeguard compliance pillar. But then we're kind of turning our attention to a different format of webinars and conversations going forwards. And just one last call. If you want to join one of these webinars with us and talk through your experiences or share anything, be more than happy to have you on. So yes, and yes, we will share the video. James will have that done by the end of the week. The email might go out next week though, with the link to that. Awesome. Appreciate it, James.
Cool. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending. It was great getting to go through this with everyone.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Cheers, guys. Bye.